Hi, and welcome to Jules Voto's Photo Focus. Today we're going to be talking about the Nikon EM. This camera was introduced in 1979, and it was the most compact camera Nikon had introduced up until that time. It's a very simple camera, very light, weighing in at 1 pound, 2 ounces, or 460 grams. Basically has one exposure mode, auto, which is aperture priority auto exposure. When it was introduced, along with it, Nikon introduced Series E lenses. These were lighter, less expensive lenses than the Nikkor lenses, made with a lot of plastic, but optically they were very good. They would work, since they were considered AIS lenses, they would work on any Nikon AI camera and would work on the older cameras via stop-down metering. All right, so let's get into the camera. Let's go over all the controls and features. Let's start with the advance lever. It has a standoff position. You could advance film in either one stroke or several smaller strokes. The shutter release is threaded for a standard cable release. The meter turns on when you put light pressure on the shutter release, and it stays on for 20 seconds after you remove your finger from the release. There's a battery check button here to the left of the advance lever. If it lights up in red, the battery is good. We also, and maybe a little hard to see, have a film plane indication here. Okay, it probably should have been done in white, but it's in black, matching the camera. We have our very limited shutter speed dial here. You have a manual setting for bulb. So when you press the release, let's cock the shutter here. When you press the release, the shutter opens. When you release it, the shutter closes. You also have a manual 90th of a second shutter speed. So if the batteries are dead, of course you lose the meter, and this is an electronic shutter in this camera. You also lose the auto setting, but the camera will fire at a 90th of a second. A 90th of a second is also the flash sync speed. Okay, and then of course we have our auto setting. You set the aperture. The camera will pick a shutter speed. Okay, and there is a needle in the viewfinder that shows you the shutter speed. You also have an additive frame counter that will count up as you take pictures. Okay, we have a hot shoe on the top. When this camera was introduced, Nikon also introduced the SBE flash. It slid into the hot shoe. It automatically set the shutter speed to a 90th of a second. And you also had a ready light in the viewfinder when the flash was charged and ready to fire. Coming over to the other side, we have our ASA, or as we call it today, ISO setting. It went from 25 up to 1600. We're just going to leave it set to 400. Now, to open the camera back, you just pull up on the rewind knob, and we'll get into loading the camera in a minute. All right, let's come over to the front of the camera. Okay, here we have the self-timer. Very simple self-timer. In fact, let's cock the shutter. Okay, we're going to pull the self-timer lever down and press the shutter release. Now you will notice, if you can see this, that the lens has stopped down to the working aperture. And it's about a 10-second delay. One other thing it does, it locks up the mirror. So that's a real nice feature if you're going to be using long exposures with this camera. You don't have a separate mirror lockup. However, by using the self-timer, it locks up the mirror, and that will cause far less vibration if you have the camera on a tripod Just press that, use that self-timer. Okay, coming over to the other side of the camera, we have the standard Nikon lens release. Okay, just press that button to remove the lens. And we also have a little button here. That is an exposure compensation button. The way that works, if you're photographing something with strong backlight, let's say your children at the beach, you hold that button in and it will increase your exposure 2 stops to compensate for that backlight. And that might seem like a lot, those 2 stops. However, it's always better to err on the side of overexposure when shooting negative film, either black and white or color. Okay, now let's just look at the back of the camera briefly. It has a film box holder, so you can remember what film you have loaded into the camera. It just slides in here. I'm not going to do that now. Okay, the viewfinder is a 92% viewfinder, shows you 92% of the image that will appear on film. The meter, I should add, has an SPD cell, so they are better than the old CDS cells, quicker response, and no memory. Now, you will notice older versions of this camera, if you've been looking around for one, are slightly different, and it's very, very minor. The battery check button on the older camera is blue. The exposure compensation button is blue, and the lens release is all black. It doesn't have this chrome outline on it. You can use other AI or AIS lenses on this camera. However, you cannot mount a non-AI lens. So those were lenses manufactured before 1977. Now, some of those lenses were converted, and that is called AI'd, but you must make sure, if you're going to mount one of those older lenses, that it has been AI'd, or else you will damage the camera. Now, there was also a motor drive for this camera, the MDE. You could shoot either single frame or continuous at 2 frames a second. One other thing about the metering, there is a scale in the viewfinder. It is marked in red from 1/60th to 1 full second. That is to indicate that you should use some type of support or hold the camera very steady. The camera also will beep. You will hear a beep if the shutter speed falls below 1/30th of a second. Again, as a reminder to use some type of support. Now, in addition to the MDE motor drive, this camera can also use the MD14 motor drive, which will give you 3 frames a second. That is a much larger motor drive, and it was introduced with the Nikon FG from 1982. On the bottom of the camera, we have 2 connections for the motor drive, here and here. We have our rewind button, which must be depressed in order to rewind film when we reach the end of the roll, and I'll show you how to load in a minute. We have a standard tripod socket, and we have our battery compartment. You can still easily find batteries for this camera. This Duracell 1/3 N lithium battery works fine. It's a 3-volt battery. Okay, so let's show you how to load film. Now, if you've seen any of my other videos, you will notice that the first thing I always say to do before loading film is to unfold the rewind crank, and this is especially true if you haven't used the camera for a while, and just turn it. If it turns freely, no resistance, you know the camera is not loaded. You don't want to open the back if you have a roll of film in the camera. Okay, so what we're going to do is we're going to just pull up on the rewind knob, okay, and the camera back swings open. And another thing, I would recommend you just set it to the M90 speed when loading film. So you're going to push up on the rewind knob, Drop the film in, push that back down. Be careful not to touch the shutter. This is a metal vertical travel shutter, but you don't want to touch it. Okay, this is a multi-slotted take-up spool, so you could just line it up, push the film in there. And of course I missed. Okay, now you're going to advance. Make sure it catches on the take-up spool. Also make sure that the top and bottom sprocket holes line up with the internal sprocket on the camera. We now close the back. Now we're going to make two blanks. So we close the back, and we're going to do one more thing before we make our two blanks. We're going to unfold the rewind crank again. And I am now going to advance, make the first blank. Now if you're looking at that rewind knob, and I'm going to do this again, watch that rewind knob as I advance the film. You will notice it is turning in the opposite direction from that arrow. That means that the film is coming out of the cartridge and going onto the take-up spool. If this rewind crank was not turning as we advanced the film, that would mean that the film did not catch onto the take-up spool, and you'd be taking pictures but not recording it on film. Okay, so now we took a bunch of great pictures, and it's time we reach the end of the roll, and we're going to rewind our film. So we're just going to press in on the rewind knob, and you make sure it stays in. Okay, turn the camera back over, going to unfold the rewind crank again, and now we're going to turn in the direction of the arrow. And you will feel resistance now. Now when you hear a couple little clicks like that, that means the film has come off the take-up spool. Now I want to save this roll. So this is my roll I use for demonstrating how to load the camera. So I don't want to rewind it all the way back into the cartridge. But once you hear that little click, that you could hear the film pull off the take-up spool, just rewind several more times to make sure the film all goes back into the cartridge. We then pull up on the rewind knob again, and there we have it. Now, if you open the back of the camera, maybe you didn't rewind it all the way and it looks like this. Well, you could just turn this right here or just push the film back in, send it off for developing. You don't want to leave a roll that's been exposed like this, because then you may reload it and you get a bunch of double exposures. Okay, so now let's look at the viewfinder. The only information you have in the viewfinder as far as exposure is the shutter speed that the camera selects. The focusing screen in this camera is identical to the Nikon case screen. It has a 12mm etched circle, which indicates the area of most sensitivity for the center weighted meter. Usually on the Nikon meters, the meter concentrates 60% of its sensitivity within this 12mm circle. You also have a microprism collar where you could focus on, and you also have a split image rangefinder spot in the center. If you were using flash, you would have a flash ready light over here on this side, and these lower shutter speeds from 1/30th to 1 second are in red. And as I said earlier, if the speed indicated by the camera was below 1/30th of a second, you would hear a beep indicating you should use some type of camera support. Now I wear glasses, and it's a little hard to see the entire screen when looking through the viewfinder. So you just kind of, move around just a little bit to see everything. Non-eyeglass wearers should have no trouble. The camera is very easy to focus, the screen is nice and bright, and the images snap in and out of focus very easily. Okay, so that's it for this little gem. Nikon's most compact camera at the time it was introduced in 1979, the EM. So I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, please give it a thumbs up and subscribe to my channel. I come out with a new video every Wednesday morning at 11 a.m. And if you have any questions on this video, if you need any clarification, please leave a question in the comments below or email me. I am happy to answer any questions. So I will talk to you next time.